So good evening and welcome to the ZWAC show. I'm your host, John Moore. We like to present to you each month something that we think is new and interesting in the zero waste space. And a couple of weeks ago, I saw a big headline in the Washington Post, and it said, "Report reveals who are the world's biggest plastic polluters." And that caught my eye. And I first thought, you mean they admitted it? But no, the article says, in fact, the article was reporting on a report published in a periodical, I think, which is called Science Advances. And the title report is Global Producer Responsibility for Plastic Pollution. And it names the biggest plastic polluters. And I'm not going to spoil the surprise to the extent it's surprising at all. But tonight we have one of the 14 authors of that, amazing report, who is the executive director of one of the sponsoring entities, which is called the Moore Institute for Plastic Pollution Research. And we've had Captain Charles Moore on the show before. So tonight I'm very happy to have one of the co-authors, Win Cowger. And I guess I'll ask him to spoil the surprise first, which is the report has an abstract, and in the abstract, it names names. So can you tell us who are, to the extent the research was able to reveal it, who are the world's biggest plastic polluters?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for that introduction. Like you said, I'm research director of the Moore Institute for Plastic Pollution Research, and we're based in Long Beach, California. So the study revealed that Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, Nestle, Altria, and Bacresca Group were the top, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 polluters. There's we could sit here and name 50 different companies that are all in the top. Actually, we found that 56 companies contribute more than 50% of the global plastic pollution.
And was the study able to identify everybody, or is there a certain percentage of plastic pollution that kind of remains unidentified for different reasons?
So the study only looked at branded plastic pollution. So about half of the plastic pollution doesn't have brands on it, either because it's never been branded or the brands wore off. So about half of the trash out there, we don't know for sure who it is that produces that, but I would guess that actually a lot of these companies are still producing that plastic too. And so we're really focused on branded plastic pollution, which is about half of it that's out there.
What was the impetus to put this report together? How did it
So
come about?
the Breakthrough from Plastic has been doing this kind of report as a white paper annually. They do this survey of brands on trash around the world. They have thousands of volunteers that help to collect this data. What they wanted to do was to put their data set in through the tests of scientific rigor. I'm known as one of the data scientists in the field that is really good at cleaning up messy data sets. And so they wanted me to go through and basically find all the bugs in their data set, clean it up as best as possible, put it through our best analytical procedures that we could. We did some new statistics and then put it through the peer review process and really give it a test.
So I did read the report. I'm a little rusty on my statistical and analytical skills, so some of it was a little hard to digest. But what can you explain sort of where the data came from and how you determined its reliability in English?
So yeah, the data comes from thousands of volunteers that are collecting data using a standardized method around the world. So we have, let's see, how many countries were there? 84 different countries where there had been at least one brand audit done. With, I think there was, let's see, 1,500 different brand audits that were conducted over the course of 5 years.
Okay.
And so that's where the data set's coming from. And then how we determined that it was rigorous is that we reanalyzed the vast majority of the data. So Breakthrough from Plastic has already done a really thorough job of curating the data set and standardizing it, but we added on an additional layer of validation to the data where we basically QA/QC'd all of their initial data input.
Was the original data primarily from beach cleanups and, reporting on what was found there?
Not specifically beaches. There's also rivers, in city parks, on a city street too. Anywhere where there's trash in the environment. So basically, the methodology is they go to a spot where there's a lot of trash. They pick it all up and then they sort it by brand, and they characterize how many pieces of trash are coming from each brand.
Got a question?
Well,
Huh?
Yeah,
yeah.
I'm just curious, the top nations, the Pacific Island nations, the Indonesia, Sumatra, Philippines, is that perhaps because we've been shipping our plastic waste overseas to be recycled and that somehow ends up in the ocean or whatever?
So I think you may be referring, should I share my screen?
Sure. Well,
Okay.
I'll have to give me a minute to figure that out.
That's okay. I'll also paste the paper in the chat. So in figure 1, we have the top countries, but this is actually where most of the reports have come from. So the country with the most reports is Indonesia. And that just means that they're very active. They do a lot of these surveys every single year. There's a really active group there. The purpose of this figure. Okay, cool. I got screen sharing.
Yeah, that one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
So the purpose of this figure is really to demonstrate where the data was collected so that we could assess whether or not this is really a global data set, and whether or not it's really fit for doing global scale analysis. So we just sorted, this is the number of survey events, and then here we have the countries ranked. So Indonesia has several hundred, USA several hundred, Tanzania several, I think there's around 100 of that, and then it starts to drop off from there. So that's just where people are collecting data, not necessarily telling you how dirty those places are. We actually didn't do an assessment on how dirty the places are compared to each other. We would need a different data set for that. It would need to be standardized in a different way.
Can I ask a question? When you say they counted the number, they counted instances or something like that, does that mean that if I have a little piece of plastic that's a 1/4 inch by a 1/2 inch, that is 1, and if I have another piece that's 2 inches by 3 inches, that's also 1?
Yep, it's all by count, and any piece of plastic that has a brand on it, that would be a count. So that would be 1. Yep.
So if I have a plastic bottle that's disintegrated into 20 pieces, that's a count of 20.
I think in their methodology they would count that as 1. I think so. Yeah. But you make a good point there about the count can be a challenging thing to standardize sometimes.
Yeah. Okay.
So I'm a
Thank you.
lawyer and I have a certain amount of experience in trying to pick apart expert reports. So I gather one of the purposes of applying a more rigorous analysis was to try to blunt some of these challenges to the interpretation of the data. Is that a fair assumption?
Yep.
So
Yeah, for sure.
is Coca-Cola now admitting that they're responsible?
Yeah, they have actually in the
Ooh.
Washington Post article, they were basically their reaction and others' reaction from the top list basically said, yeah, we know that we are responsible for this and we're doing something about it. The only company from the top, I think they were reporting, the journalists like to just give the top 5. So they were reporting on this figure here. And so they had Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Nestle, Danone, and Altria. Altria really is quite upset that they are in the top 5, and they're trying to poke holes in the study quite a bit, but none of their arguments are really holding any weight.
What do they make? Who's Altria?
So yeah, they are the owners of Philip Morris USA. And actually, if this was really accurate, it would be Altria and Philip Morris International, because they're 2 separate companies, but they own the same brands. And that's what makes it challenging for us we can't decouple them, because we're doing a brand audit and trying to attribute that to companies. And so when 2 companies own the same brands, we basically lump them together.
I was going to ask, what are some of the challenges in trying to identify the brands? I gather different companies use different brands. Some have different names in different countries. Can you describe some of the challenges of trying to figure out what brand is who?
Yeah, it's really challenging. I mean, you have different languages, you have different ways that the labels are presented. So in some countries, you may have, labels that are more challenging to interpret than others. In general, I think this isn't that it's not that tricky, because companies want to have branding that's unique globally, especially multinational companies. Like if some other company came up and said, "Oh yeah, I want to use the Coke brand," like you bet they're gonna have a legal battle on their hands, right? Coke will try to like hold that copyright or that what's called trademark uh, for everything that they can. And that's the same for a lot of these companies. They have really recognizable brands, but there are some unique brands that we ran into where it's kind of like, um, for example, let's say there's like Coca-Cola vanilla. That's one option of that's one of the brands of Coca-Cola. Um, Sometimes people may record on the brand sheet just the word vanilla, because that's what they saw. They thought that was the brand. It's the vanilla drink or whatever. So you have some of those kind of errors that can creep in. Most of those errors actually work out in favor of these companies. It actually reduces their responsibility or how responsible they are, because we end up not linking it back to them. So all of these should really be interpreted as underestimates. They are likely higher than this. I don't expect that they're higher than this by a lot. I think we did a pretty good job on the data cleanup. It's probably like a few percent, but they're most likely higher than this.
What kind of products, branded products are these companies most associated with that are reporting this pollution?
Well, the 2 top ones, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Nestle, they make a lot of different candies. So all of these top 4, these are all food and beverage companies. And the number 5 is a tobacco company. So fast moving consumer goods is really what we're seeing across all of these. Actually, these are all food, beverage, and tobacco. There's a couple other tobacco groups in here too, British American Tobacco.
Looks like sugar and nicotine.
Yep.
Now you got me curious, because the top 4 are, beverage bottles, but the 5th one down there is tobacco. So I'm kind of wondering, for an apples to apples now, are you comparing water bottles with maybe cigarette filters or something, or how does that apples to apples comparison?
Yeah, it's based on count. So this is all based on the count. And yeah, you make a good point. If we would convert this into mass, it may be different. You may find that it's a slightly different way of assessing the problem. When we think about this, is like a very, very something that we debate a lot in our field, actually, is that you have count measurements and mass measurements, and they have different utilities. So the mass measurement really tells you something about the long-term risk or the long-term consequences of a product. It can break into, millions of little pieces. But the count actually tells you about the immediate risk. It's already in many little pieces. And it's already very likely that something is going to encounter it or it's going to move somewhere far away. So that's kind of how I think about it anyways. And when you're interpreting this data, you should think about this as like, this is kind of a short-term problem that we're looking at. But in the long term, if we had considered it in terms of mass, it may show us something different.
That's interesting.
After this report was publicized in the Washington Post, have you noticed any interest in regulators to taking a closer look at these companies?
We have had some lawyers actually reach out to us that are interested in taking these findings to some courts.
Mhm.
I wouldn't be surprised if this is used in that context or used as support for different policies. For example, SB 54 would be a great policy to use this data because they've already made this assumption that these companies are responsible for the plastic pollution problem and should pay for it. But they actually don't have, as far as I understand, they don't have the real hard data to back it up. So they may face some challenges when they go into court with these companies.
I've had conversations with some public agencies about bringing legal action to clean up the mess, so to speak, and this data would be helpful for something like that. But in these kind of nuisance cases, you need a public agency to be the plaintiff. And a lot of public agencies, they're underfunded, they're understaffed, and they have other things they want to do, and they don't have the resources to do this. So I'm wondering if you're seeing any motivation to use this report by public agencies.
Yeah, so far no public agencies have reached out to me. Specifically, all I've had is a lawyer reach out to me about interest in using this. I mean, we just published it 2 weeks ago, so I feel like it probably will take some time for it to really get that level of adoption and people to think about it and read it and everything. But I would love to collaborate with public agencies who do want to use this data. It likely one of the major findings actually is this figure here, which basically shows that if all you need to know is how much plastic a company produces in your region by mass, and you can predict how much pollution of theirs you'll see in the environment. So there's like a 1-to-1 relationship between plastic mass pollution and plastic mass production and plastic count pollution.
Does it relate to geography at all? Or is that a sort of a national scale?
Sorry, does it relate to what?
Geography, is the place of production equal the place of pollution?
We didn't downscale this yet. I would expect this to be a pretty general trend, but maybe when we downscale it, we'll find something that I'm not expecting.
So we've highlighted a couple of things that were important findings. What other, important points do you want to highlight about the report and the findings?
So in this figure here, some other things that I find really interesting. One of them is that food and beverage companies are skewed upward. So they're in this relationship, they're per amount of plastic that they produce, we see more of their pollution compared to household and retail companies. And that to me really suggests that reuse is one of the best ways or a very good way to reduce plastic pollution. because household and retail goods are more, they're typically used more often. They also aren't used outside of a highly managed system like a house or an office or something like that too. So that was kind of an interesting finding. I think that's quite useful. Also, this relationship suggests that if you decrease plastic production, you should see decreases in plastic pollution, which I think is a good thing. And a lot of companies are aware of this and are trying to move. I think actually, just today I was reading about Coca-Cola reducing their plastic production, trying to reduce their plastic production by making lighter bottles, which maybe isn't the best way to go about it, but it's in the step in the right direction.
So going back to the
Mhm.
trying, a lot of these companies say they're trying, and a lot of these companies have pledges to do certain things by certain dates, usually 10, 20 years in the future. Which companies out there do you think are really trying or making an impact?
Yeah,
if any.
I think so. This plot ideally would tell us that. And so you'd be able to see outliers in these relationships that you can't easily explain away. So like one of them, for example, this McCormick and Company Inc. This is a food, I think they make like spices or something like that, right? Um, and so what are they doing that's unique? I mean, their goods, spices, you're not just like using that for a single day and then throwing it away. Usually, it's like kind of a long-term use of a piece of plastic. I hope I got that right. McCormick and Company, is that right? They're a spice company, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
that's what I thought. So they're an outlier in this plot, which is kind of a unique thing. Like, maybe something's going on there where they've actually figured out how to do it better. And it's really just because it's a longer term use. And so they're kind of an outlier in the food and beverage sector because all these other companies are like, use it once, throw it away. They want it to be, they want you to use like 10 of their items every day and just throw it straight in the trash. So yeah, and then there's some other ones that kind of stand out like really bad. Like this one, Cliff Bar, is like an outlier in the opposite direction. They don't actually produce that much plastic, but we see a lot of their plastic in the environment. And that one kind of suggests that, well, Cliff Bar and Company, I mean, they're encouraging you to go out into the environment with their products,
Yeah.
And so you're out there and they're encouraging you to use a lot of them. So that could be why we see that company as such an outlier. But what's crazy too is that the rest of the companies, the food and beverage sector, like they're just in a straight line. And for what that suggests to me is that the status quo is just like controlling everything. I mean, none of these companies are really standing out as doing anything much better than the other one. So in general, I don't see a lot of like positive things from companies in this. If I would have seen a lot more scatter, that would have suggested to me that certain companies have kind of figured out better systems. But the fact that this is a one-to-one line really just says to me that in general, companies are all kind of towing the line. And even though they're making these big promises, we're not seeing a lot of results from that.
I
Got
was
another question. Can I ask you?
Yeah.
When it comes to single-use bottles, in the United States, a lot of states have what's called cash reduction value. So those are taken out of the circulation or they're reused and that kind of thing. Now,
Right.
what about other countries? Do they have any kind of a buyback for their bottles, or are they just simply tossed? Or do you know if there's any kind of a campaign to, you know, somehow encourage buyback for single-use bottles at all?
There definitely is in Europe. They definitely have buyback programs and stuff. I'm not sure about other countries. because I haven't looked too much into that. But yeah, in Europe, and even in Europe, they're trying to move in a lot of the countries in Europe away from plastic bottles altogether into like reusable glass bottles. So they're standardizing their bottles and all sorts of things like that, which is really good.
I was wondering about Cliff
Mhm.
Bar. Have you heard from them? And I asked because they're a local Bay Area company. They're in Emeryville where they have their big warehouse and production facilities. I've toured the place. I've met their general counsel. He touted all the wonderful progressive things that they are and do. Have you heard from them? Because I would think they'd be surprised to be on this list.
Yeah, I have not heard from them. They are not like top 10 or anything like that. They're not even, let's see right now. 10. Yeah, so they're like 0.1% of the global plastic pollution. So
They wouldn't be ashamed of that.
I mean, yeah, they're not like they shared data. So another interesting thing too here is that the data for the plastic production is from the companies.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
they volunteered that, and then volunteers from this totally separate group collected the other data set. And so
Mhm.
we're merging these two to try to understand what's going on. So what is really good from companies is that they're willing to volunteer data on this, and that I think this shows that they volunteered like accurate data, pretty accurate data. So I'm happy about that, and I hope that they'll continue to do that, and see the value in this kind of information.
Did the data suggest anything about the efficacy of plastic recycling efforts as they've been traditionally done?
We did not look into plastic recycling efforts and how that might vary by country. A future step that we'd like to look into is to see if these trends change by different countries. Maybe we do see shifts in some of these relationships, and that may indicate that certain policies are more or less effective in different countries.
Yeah, that would be interesting to know.
Yeah,
Could you share some of can you identify some of the other groups that collaborated with this report?
yeah. So we had ton of different authors. We had over 10 authors from around the world. Kathy's out at CSIRO. Sybil that's in Australia. Sybil is at Breakthrough from Plastic here in the US. Katie's up in Portland. Jorge is out in the Philippines, I believe. Yep, the Philippines. So this is really a global group of researchers. Lisa is at Five Gyres, and so is Marcus. Tricia is out in New Zealand. Denise is out in CSIRO in Australia too. Christina's from Estonia. Natalie
Estonia.
is from the East Coast. Yaden Lee she's out in the UK. So yeah, like really all over the place.
Do you have Zoom meetings where you have to coordinate time zones?
We did have several Zoom meetings, and unfortunately, Australia almost always got the was not able to attend because their time zone is just really different than everybody else's.
17 hours or something, yeah.
So how do you ever put together a big group like that of researchers? It's really quite remarkable.
Thanks. Yeah, so some of these folks I knew, and I reached out to them because I knew that they would be interested and they would be a good collaborator on a project like this. Usually when you're starting a project like this, that's one of the first questions you ask, like, who would I like to be involved? and you consider, well, who can contribute to this? Who might be able to help us to get the message out? Who might be able to contribute some resources that we need, or some expertise that we need on the team? And for this, I worked with Breakthrough from Plastic to identify folks that they knew within their group who had already worked with this data, who had already talked about some of these like really big questions that we wanted to tackle. And started by reaching out to several of them. And a lot of people are open to collaborating if you just reach out. One of the ways that academics especially are graded is and ranked is by the number of publications and how important the publications are that we get out. So generally people, if it's something that's within their wheelhouse, they're willing to do it, especially if they're not going to be on the hook for I was lead author, so that meant that I had to draft the majority of the manuscript and kind of like do a lot of project management, do the data analysis, that kind of stuff. I ended up doing a lot of the heavy lifting, whereas like the rest of the co-authors contributed in other ways that weren't as time intensive.
So
Another question.
you are paid by somebody. Who is that?
So I was paid by several people. Breakthrough from Plastic paid me for a little bit of my time, but this project ended up becoming a bit of a passion project because it ballooned. The QA/QC on the data analysis took months, and we didn't anticipate that. So the budget was blown out of the water after the first like few sentences of the paper, and then we pieced together funding from the Moore Institute for Plastic Pollution Research. We are a nonprofit and we have family foundation donors. We had some funding from them that we were able to use. Also, I'm funded by the National Renewable Energy Lab to do to advance data analysis in this field. And so I was able to use some of that funding to help with the actual data analysis steps. So it's really like piecemealed together to fund a project like this. Sometimes you can get all the funding from one source, but recently, at least, I've been piecemealing things together.
Do you have a follow-on plan or a follow-on project in the works for this?
Yeah, I think the next project for this is to try to downscale this analysis down to the country level. Look at, do we see differences in the top polluters in different countries? Do we see differences in some of these other trends in different countries? I think that would teach us a lot more about the problem.
Would you use the same data set to make that analysis?
What's that?
Would you use the same data to make that analysis?
Yeah, most likely. We would probably need to just do it in the countries where we have a lot of data, like Indonesia, USA, Tanzania, just the top countries. Because once you start getting into very few surveys, like around here, some of these countries, we only have 10 surveys or something like that. It's not really representative of a whole country.
Got another question. It looks like your data is mostly aggregated plastic bottles and maybe food containers and whatnot. If you separate the two categories, in other words, you have the top four seem to be plastic beverage manufacturers. Well, at the other end, the food wrappers and things like that. In terms of total quantity, can you separate that out, or is the data separated, disaggregated to see what the trends are among? You mentioned about one of the ones that I think are basically plastic bottle manufacturers also have candy wrappers. Do I understand that correctly, or?
Yeah, like Nestle, for example, they have and actually Coke and Pepsi also own other food products besides just bottles. in the raw data set, you can disaggregate based on product type. Like, is it a bottle? Is it a
Right.
wrapper? Is it other things? We didn't dive into that, but that would be a really interesting thing to dive into.
Neil, did you have a question?
Yes, but I have to preface it by saying I came in late, and I've seen the last few minutes of the presentation of the data, but has it been discussed or will it be discussed as far as what policies and actions should be taken given the data? Are we going to? I assume that will be part of the discussion tonight. If not, I am going to be very quiet.
That's odd.
I think I can do it.
Well, Neil, we talked about that a little bit before you joined us, and I think that, Wayne, correct me if I'm wrong, but there has been some that interest in the companies that are identified seem to be respecting the validity of the report. There is some interest from lawyers, of course, about using the data for probably prosecuting these polluters, which wouldn't be a bad thing. But the report was published 2 weeks ago, so I think, Wynn, correct me if I'm wrong, you're kind of waiting for it to take hold and create action.
Yeah, I think it's the beginning of something a lot larger. I think there's a lot of discussions right now about extended producer responsibility, and unfortunately, until now, there hadn't really been a thorough analysis to support some of these extended producer responsibility actions. And so what this analysis does is it develops a framework for any type of or many types of extended producer responsibility that you may want to assess. And it does that by identifying companies' responsibility to their trash in the environment based on their brands. So yeah, there's a lot of different things that this data is already suggesting as like probably effective policies. One of them is in this figure here, where it suggests that reducing plastic production should also reduce plastic pollution, which makes a lot of sense. So any extended producer responsibilities that like set limits on plastic production or new plastic production should be effective. Also, this suggests that food and beverage sector has a lot more responsibility than household and retail. So any extended producer responsibility that's kind of more focused on food and beverage or thinks about how you can create products that are more like household and retail should be more effective too. Hopefully that's helpful.
Win,
Yeah.
if I may continue, John, allow me. I just moved back to very close to New York City, so I'm starting to think like a New York cab driver. And a New York cab driver might say, any cab driver could have told you who the main culprits are. And the data is important, but the data doesn't change thinking. And my sense is that, and if you've covered this again, I won't go over it again, but there is such a drastic challenge to us at this point. The number of virgin plastic plants, manufacturing plants, 55 have been built. You know this stuff. 55 have been built in the last 10 years. 33 more are on the planning boards. Billions of dollars into production of virgin plastic.
Yep.
And this data it could help, and it's important, but the main thing is that we have to stop them. And in addition to stopping the production, they are promoting, and from what I can tell, getting away with a mass solution for plastic, and that is incineration. They've lobbied 25 states that have approved incineration of plastic and other garbage as recycling. Those 25 states have put up billions of dollars to subsidize this. production of more and more plastic and plastic incineration.
Right.
And the only hope we have at this point is that the federal EPA can preempt those 25 states and say, no, you can't do that using the Air Rights Board. And
Right.
they are under attack. Every day, lobbyists are hitting them to change the definition of incineration to include pyrolysis. And that's what we have to mobilize against.
Right.
And I thought we were going to be discussing EPR because EPR, I see, to the extent it's being put in the United States and Canada, is the perfect camouflage for continued mobilization of the plastic industry. And it blurs responsibility. In some cases, like California and Colorado, it literally abdicates responsibility. And I know that, and we're fighting this in New York State now. People say, and in Colorado and California, they have said that that it's okay because we have citizen advisory committees, which of course is foolish. But the key is, and I'm not as articulate as I should be, that if these laws go in, if these PROs who run the EPR systems get power, it makes it harder and harder for the federal EPA to resist the pressure to allow incineration. And that is why I wanted to talk about EPR particularly and the California model. The state agencies, Cal Recycle, have been incompetent. New York DEC has been absolutely incompetent. So people say, well, we need corporations to run this thing. It's suicide. We need independent stop waste organizations like Alameda County on a federal level, and we need to tax landfills and tax plastic. It's very, very simple.
Neil, I think tonight we were just trying to establish that Win's report helps validate the data that was already out there and make a stronger point of the things that are in the report that hopefully catalyze the politicians' desire to regulate more. But he's not, he's a data analyst, I think, not an EPR advocate.
Well, then, okay, it's my fault. And I think I'll just criticize you, John, for putting EPR in the.
Well, wait a minute. We've got that young guy here. And he's, we're old guys, Neil. And John is getting on toward old, and a few other people on this call are also old. But you are a young guy, and for that reason, you're a little bit malleable, I hope. And so these kinds of considerations,
flexible.
these kinds of considerations that Neil is bringing up are really important. 10 years ago, I was on the plastics task force of the Ecology Center in Berkeley. And as part of the work I did, I put together 2 pieces of quotes from just using quotes from only the plastics industry itself. And everything that Neil just talked about now, they were talking about then. And they were subverting our language. They were using it against us. They were weaponizing our language against us, that being the recyclers. They were more interested in they wanted to call incineration recycling and have it counted as recycling when it actually destroys the material. So that led to a big discussion that went on for years and years and years. So I think it's appropriate that we talk to young people like you about this, and hopefully get you to see that it's a problem that goes back a ways, and it will be with us in the future unless we do the kinds of things that Neil is calling for.
Yeah, for sure. I'm on board. I'm open to different perspectives, and I do agree that the current way that EPR is being done doesn't seem to be effective. So, yeah, I think we have a lot of work to do, unfortunately. And I
Okay.
think the main thing that this report shows is that these companies are responsible for the materials that they produce, and
It's really
their
valuable.
decisions have an impact on the environment. And if we're gonna let them continue the status quo, we'll be seeing more pollution. So we need to change something.
So
Good on you, Mike.
Oh, good for you, good for you.
could we do a new statistical analysis on the efficacy of EPR to reduce plastic pollution?
That would be interesting. Yeah, you could check and see like on a country level that has EPR, if we see differences in these trends.
Oh, that would be
certain countries-
Canada. That would be Canada because Canada has a whole national policy of EPR.
Yeah, maybe maybe we will see some sort of differences in Canada if we downscaled this. Maybe
Well-
some EPR is good, is high quality. Some strategies are high quality. I definitely
Canada's
agree that
EPR is not high quality.
what's
It
that?
is not. Canada's EPR is not high quality. It is
Yeah.
designed to
True.
maintain the status quo.
Well,
Okay.
at
Yeah.
at least Neil and Dan, now that you know, if you wanted to hire somebody to do a statistical analysis on these important issues, you know who to talk to, right?
Well, not only at least, but at most as well. And so, I do welcome you to the movement.
Thanks.
Recycling, reuse, and composting are a social movement. And
Yeah.
it's one of the biggest in the world. And it was there before Earth Day, but Earth Day really set it on its course that we're on now. And here, for example, I mean, my last things that I'm doing are chronicling the beginnings of that movement, but also going beyond it to before the movement and doing that in the words of the people who got it started. It's really fascinating stuff. And
Well,
I think I'll continue, and you are now inheriting, and I hereby pass the baton to you.
All right. I'll take it.
Dan, we can't bias him because one of the fundamental things about statistical analysis is you have to control out the biases. So we don't want to bias win on these things.
Oh, come on. No, wait a minute.
No,
I'm a sociologist, and my mentor was C. Wright Mills. And if you get too bogged down in numbers, what he would call you is an abstracted empiricist. And what he
Well, let
wanted
me-
was a more activist kind of science, where
Let
you
me add-
actually go out there and do things, and you see how they work, and you make the world a better place by using science as the foundation of what you do. Our company, Urban Ore, is based on that principle.
Let me offer to Win support. You mentioned the difficulty of fundraising. I think we all know about that. But I'd be happy to take time to talk to you about potential sources of funding for ongoing research.
Sweet. Thanks. Appreciate
So,
it.
Neil knows where the money is.
well, some of it, but let me put my email in the chat, and we could make a date to talk. Hold on.
That sounds good.
We should also say that, and credit Neil with something. He was probably the foremost incinerator fighter in the United States, other than Paul Connett, who was mostly international. Neil did it nationally, and he probably stopped or probably up somewhere in the hundreds. I think it was around 300.
Well, no, actually, 300 or closer to 400 was the total number of incinerators defeated by citizen action.
Yeah.
I have participated in 35 successful campaigns to kill incinerators all across the country and Bermuda. But we lost in Bermuda and we lost in Spokane, Indiana. So my batting record is 35-2.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, but no one pays money for 35 and 2 incinerator killers. It's not like a batting average of 350.
So Win, I don't want to leave this with you being called an abstract empiricist.
Don't worry, I don't take anything personally.
Because that's like an insult, but I want
Wright Mills is dead, by the way, so don't worry about it.
So Win, thank you for joining us tonight and sharing the details of the report. It was hard to read, but I was glad I read it, and had a lot of value in it, and thank you for doing it.
Thanks.
We're going to turn our show tonight to talk a little about the recycling archives, which you're certainly welcome to stay. But we do have, every month we do a segment. We do two segments. We do something that's going on now, and then we talk about something that went on in the past that was good. And the past is called, we call it the recycling archives. Susan Kinsella is here tonight. She's the director of the archives, and she wants to talk about a little bit about the archive process and what goes into it. So Susan, I'll turn it over to you. And you're muted.
Susan, you're muted.
Yep, I'm back now, right? Yep. Thank you. I've got a bunch of notes that I want to use in order to tell you about how we do our interview process, because it's a lot more involved than I think people realize, and I think it turns out really great interviews. So that's what I want to tell you more about. First, I want to give you a bit of background, though. It's particularly about the development of the early community recycling systems in the US, which was really challenging, exciting, inspiring, creative, and seemingly never-ending expanding of details that nobody had really thought a whole lot about before. But while it was often exhausting and demanding, it was also a lot of fun. It was far more than just collection programs, though, even though those were the most visible to the public. And there were also manufacturers who were experimenting with adding recycled content to their products, and purchasers who were trying to figure out how to adapt their contracts to buy recycled products. And then after all that, that started around 1970, and then like 20 years later, we suddenly realized we also need to prioritize reducing waste and reusing products even before getting to recycling. So in getting all the recycling systems going that we see now, there was a lot to do. And since we were creating a new environmental movement, there was plenty of room for people to jump in and use their creativity and develop and carry all kinds of responsibilities that they most likely wouldn't have had much chance to use in order if they were in more established kinds of businesses. And the people that did that jumping in often proved to be extraordinary, and they have amazing stories to tell and lessons to pass on. So many of the people that we've interviewed talk about how they were inspired by the first Earth Day in 1970 to do something to save the Earth. And this often took the form of creating recycling drop-off centers and sometimes independent versions of local or door-to-door pickups of recycling materials with their personal vehicles in a lot of cases. So over the next couple of decades, more and more of the system was developed. And within about 25 years, in the mid-1990s, many programs were fairly well established, even though there was still plenty more to do. But of course, those original recycling pioneers were getting older too. And still, it was a shock when we began to lose some of them to unexpected deaths. And that caused Neil Seldman in Washington, D.C., and Dan Knapp here in Berkeley to come up with a plan to record as many of the early recyclers and change makers as possible so that we could preserve their history and that of the recycling movement itself overall and pass on their wisdom. So Dan and Neil arranged a retreat in the Adirondacks of New York State for a couple of dozen prominent recyclers in 2007. And there, in between lots of brainstorming sessions and presentations, these recyclers recorded interviews with each other, following a list of 22 questions that Dan had developed. And that was a start. But then the project was in slow motion for several years after, with some transcriptions of the interviews getting done, but not much more movement forward. And then 10 years later, Gretchen Brewer, one of those recyclers who'd been at... at the Adirondacks Mountain meeting, died suddenly in 2017. So Dan decided to speed up action on creating the archives and made it a small project of his reuse business at Urban Ore. I was helping to arrange Gretchen's memorial, and I told him how much Gretchen and I had often talked about, oh, we want to be able to help on the archives project. And that's how I ended up as executive director. So now we have many dozens of interviews at various levels of development, and we're close to being able to unveil a new website that will hold the archives interviews and a lot of other materials along with them. Now, you might ask, what do you mean by various levels of development for an interview? So that's what I want to tell you about. In general, many of the interviews that you might see online or in printed materials appear to be recorded and then transcribed, cleaned up slightly, and then printed pretty close to as is, often in a question and answer format. And they might also have been from a podcast. And that appears to be a pretty fast process. Plus, it means that whatever the speaker said in the original interview is likely to be in the printed version. But that's not what we do. We're focused on wanting to showcase each person we interview, telling their stories as clearly as possible, tracing the development of their work, and placing it against the background of the historical development of recycling in general. And plus, we want to draw out insights and lessons that might help guide us for the future as well. So here's the steps that we follow. First, we set up an interview. I've been doing most of the interviews recently, so I start by setting up a date with the person I want to talk to. And usually, an interview is going to take maybe 1 to 3 hours, and often like at least 2 to 3 hours. And sometimes we end up planning on 2 sessions. Originally, we did those interviews usually in person or sometimes by phone and recorded on an audio recorder. But since the start of the pandemic, I've generally done them on Zoom, with the voice recorder as an additional backup. And then there's some preparation. Sometime before the interviews, I send them Dan Knapp's 22 questions to give them an idea of what we might cover, and also a copy of The Founder's Hearts, which is a volume continuing the highlights of about a dozen of the early interviews. So they get an idea of how those interviews generally come out when they're done. And then we get to actually conducting the interview. The list of 22 questions that have always been used as an underlay to the interviews and sort of knits them together is inspiring, and it's great at uncovering many stories. But I also find if I just ask them in order, they don't always encourage enough of the spontaneity and the range of stories that I hope to achieve. Also, many of the questions are pretty specific to collection types of recycling work, but I'm also interviewing people who are artists and educators and public speakers and publishers and manufacturers, as well as those who worked in other parts of the recycling cycle. So I tend to launch the interview with the first question, which is, when and how did you first become aware of recycling as a distinct idea? And that usually leads to stories about the person's childhood or maybe school and college years, and it sets a direction that sends us off and running in the topics that matter most to the person I'm interviewing. So I found that it's really important to be curious and often maybe even kind of nosy. The more questions that one asks to follow up the stories, the more detailed they're likely to be, and even bring out more stories as well. Then I circle back towards the end of the interview to pick up any of the 22 questions we haven't already touched on that are still relevant. And that varies by the recycling field area that the speaker worked in. Although there are some questions that always bring up thoughtful answers, such as, do you think there's a spiritual dimension to recycling? And do you recall any instances of violence, intimidation, or threats? And when I'm interviewing women, I often ask them, what's been your experience as a woman working in recycling? That often elicits answers about sometimes appalling discrimination in the early years, but it also brings up stories about how women were at times able to get things done that might not have been so easily accepted if a man had done them. And then we get to transcription after we have the recordings. And once I have these recordings of the interview, I need to get it transcribed. So in the beginning, I did that too. But now I work with a changing cast of wonderful transcribers working part-time with me who turn the script around usually within a couple of weeks. In fact, we'll probably need to add another transcriber later this summer as I start to build up again on doing more interviews. By the way, we've tried out various transcription apps, but so far we found those to be woefully wanting. And one of the transcribers said, you know, it takes more work to correct everything the apps get wrong than it does to just do it all by yourself. And I think everybody else's experience with apps has led to the same assessment as well. The transcription also reveals some things that I wasn't aware of when I did the interview. I have at least a couple of important goals for it. One is to try to keep within the written transcript much of the individuality of the speaker's speech as possible. I've come to truly appreciate how interviews that sounded wonderful and totally comprehensible when I was talking with the person being interviewed then become so individualistic when trying to write down their language and their lilt. Some people speak very fast and maybe even swallow the ends of their words, which is part of why the apps have so much trouble with creating a readable script, while others speak really softly, or they don't always finish their sentences before running on to the next thought, or they seem to never end a sentence sometimes before just rolling into the next one. Some people have even started singing or speaking another language, which is great fun. And of course, there are lots of terms that are common in our field, but not easily recognized by most listeners, both human and electronic, if they're not already steeped in them. Now, one of the mistakes from trying to use the translator apps that still makes me laugh is how, in 2 different interviews about San Diego's recycling program, the speaker was referring to the El Cajon Canyon near San Diego, but the app was adamant that we were actually carrying on a conversation about alcohol. So in editing this transcript, I do take out most of the ums and the ahs and the you knows, but I also strive for letting the speaker's distinctive way of speaking show up on the page so that even in the printed version, it sounds like them talking. And then I want it to be printed in a way that it's easy for people to read it so that the reader can hear, in a way, the speaker's voice. And then comes the magic part. I send it off to Dan Knapp to turn it into a narrative, what he calls the edit for print. He has a lot of training and expertise in oral history. So he starts by reading the whole transcript through and creating a kind of mind meld with it. Usually stories come out in pieces during the interview, with later memories expanding on and deepening ideas towards the end that might have actually started out as a partial story at the beginning. So Dan may change the order of the interview around and move sentences to create whole stories or fuller explanations, and also usually to create a fairly linear sequence, while at the same time staying true to the speaker's original words. And as he explains it, when you're talking, you're not really thinking so much linear as you're thinking, what's my recovered memory of this? Because a lot of times, we've just asked this question that people hadn't really thought about for a long time. So we may move sentences to unite all the pieces of the story into one clear description. Dan says, part of the editing process then is to find the beats being the beginning and the end of a story. So finding the beats is a matter of finding where a story stops and where it starts. Those might be far apart from each other in the spoken interview. And then what's in between, how it supports what the final thing is, the final conclusion that you come to at the end of each story that leaves you with an emotional understanding of what's just happened. So that's a pretty big part of the editorial process. And there are always many stories throughout the interview that need this work. Also, the speaker might mention events that today's reader might find unfamiliar, so Dan adds in a footnote to explain it. And then he adds in headlines that help keep the reader's focus. And actually, the headlines can be a shorthand way of reading through the whole interview. And then he does a back and forth email conversation with the person who was interviewed, getting their corrections and their additions and deletions until they agree, yep, this interview is done. Our focus is to showcase and celebrate each person's work as we preserve the history. We don't consider the interview finished until each person feels that it's exactly right and includes everything they want in it. That brings us to the formatting and finishing. So after they've come to an agreement on the finished product, I do a finalized editing process to bring it into our finished format and add pictures, which we hope every person will provide to us. And then we're at this point, I'm also working with a tech expert on developing a website to make these wonderful interviews accessible to everybody. Right now, we've gotten the website close to the point of being able to go online as a beta version, but even that as a beta version will be great, I think. And I think we're going to be ready to do that by early summer. And then an update to the website will include what I call bite-sized quotes that you'll be able to pull together to find out what these interviews have to say about many different topics and to get introduced to recyclers you may not have known before. And I think it's a little bit more drilling down than if you just Googled it, which brings up a whole lot of maybe extraneous information, but we're coding it in a way that will bring answers to a lot of specific kinds of questions people might ask. So, as you can see, it's a long and complex process to go from an original interview to one ready to publish. And that's because we don't want to do gotcha interviews that just print whatever somebody said when maybe they hadn't thought about it all the way through yet. Instead, we want the interviews to be a collaboration so that each person feels that theirs is a great representation of the unique energy and work that they've poured into helping to create the recycling field over the past several decades. I'm particularly excited about how we're creating a history that wasn't available before. I remember when I worked for a conservatory paper company where we pioneered most of the recycled content papers, we often got calls from journalists asking us for studies to back up everything that we were saying. And I'd have to tell them, things are just moving so fast. Nobody's got time to do the kinds of studies that you're asking for. Well, now there are a lot more studies, but even those leave out much of the actual history of how this field, which started out as an environmental movement, eventually turned into a global industry and still has a lot of development to come. So we think it's essential to remember and to celebrate the people who created this history, and it's wonderful. It's really a lot of fun to be part of doing that. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you for that wonderful description of the long and winding road that you are taking to. But ultimately, the finished product really is marvelous. I hope it's available as soon as possible on the web. Thanks for all your help in doing it. So each month, this show, the second Tuesday of the month, has something good that's new and something good that's old. And next month, Susan will present an excerpt of some of the finished product from the recycling archives. The interview next month will stretch the boundaries of zero waste a little bit because I will be interviewing Julie Lake, who is the executive director of a local nonprofit called Beyond Emancipation, who is going to talk about her work in providing structure for young adults who have graduated from the foster care program. Not that we're preventing their waste, but we're going to talk about how that ties into the overall purposes and goals of zero waste. So I hope to see you all next month. And that's it for the show tonight. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.